So here we are, first question and answer video in a few years, and boy is there a lot to get through. I'll try and rattle through as many as possible, and like last time, if I get your username wrong, then I apologise in advance. Jim van der Kolk asks, "Hey Chris, have any plans for another bunch of slip specials on German locomotives?" Well, I'm not going to say never, but there's no plans at the moment. There are indeed many other German types that I'd like to cover at some stage, like the entire 01 Pacific family, maybe the Class 23-262s, which could actually be covered fairly easily by comparison. There's other German narrow gauge stuff, such as the Mikado tanks running on the Molly at Bad Doberan. But the thing is, there's other types that I need to get around to starting and even finishing first. It probably won't happen without another crowdfunding campaign, but we'll see what happens. Just another person on YouTube 7130 asks, "Hey Chris, I've seen mixed feelings on this, but what are your opinions on the new upgrades proposed by Cross Country to their Voyagers?" Well, I can't say I've really had the experience of Cross Country that I can recall, but if they're trying to squeeze in more seats on the existing space, then I do wonder how much comfort is likely to be compromised. Carriage interiors have been modelled on aircraft interiors since the mid-60s, and the days of comfort and luxury seem to have been thrown out in favour of just packing as many people in as possible. Now, I fully believe railway engineers when they say the likes of the Hitachis have their strengths from an operational and maintenance point of view, but I've always felt comfortable on the old Grand Central HSTs. So I understand why the upgrades are being made, but I do wonder how much they'll benefit the passengers over the shareholders. Norwegian Coffee asks, "Hey Chris, if money was no object, what would your dream layout consist of and what era would you aim for?" Money no object? Who wouldn't want their own miniature Wonderland-sized setup? Preferably with British, European and American stock representing eras 1 through to about 4 on both standard and narrow gauge. Nathaniel Kempson-Burns asks, "Hey Chris, if you had the power and the money to, what new build steam loco would you commission and where would you run it?" Many ideas chop and change every so often, but I always keep coming back to the LMS Turbomotive. If that could have been perfected, then I wonder if it could have been the chance to reinvent the technology. Never mind the 5AT, this is where it could have been at. William Sawyers asks, "Hey Chris, what are your opinions on the central door locking fiasco at West Coast?" Honestly, if I facepalmed any harder, I'd punch a hole in my neighbour's wall. While I don't know the full ins and outs on the operation of a mainline rail tour company and the financial nuances that go with them, I am reliably informed that warnings had been made about this sort of thing since pre-COVID days, and other companies were taking steps long before West Coast had to change tack. I don't know. I don't want to be harsh on anybody, seeing as I don't claim to be any kind of expert, and I get that sometimes difficult compromises have to be made when it comes to investments with finite income streams. But I ask the public, if you had a choice between needing to upgrade your operational passenger carrying coaching stock in order to keep running trains and wanting to buy more out-of-ticket locomotives just to increase your collection, which would you go for? Paul Lawrence asks, "Hey Chris, with all the announcements of brand new model locos that we either waited years for or simply came out of the blue, what ones are you looking forward to seeing and possibly buying?" Ones I'm looking forward to seeing? Well, the new Hornby Saint is definitely a welcome look. That new Clarkworks WD looks quite nice, as does Sonic Model's K-Class Mogul. I'm looking forward to seeing Rapido's S160s, and I'm hoping someone has the tooling to Hatton's Genesis coaching stock and does another run of them. Because, I'm sorry, but if I paid £1,100 for some second-hand coaches, I'd never want to get them out the box. Ones I'm hoping to be able to obtain one day include Effie's new T3, preferably with salmon and brown coaching stock, and Rapido's Eye of the Engine, because how could you not? Come on! Mystic Mind asks, "Hey Chris, do you have a favourite heritage railway on any gauge, be it for the journey, motive power, variety, etc.? Well, I don't really have favourites like I used to, because experiences often change from visit to visit every few years or so. The Bluebell used to be my favourite, and I rarely have a bad time when I go there, but the more I've gone into this job, more and more people from so many heritage lines have been very welcoming and friendly. Sure, I've been told stories from people who've had maybe not quite so good experiences with certain railways, and I'm not going to dispute or enable them. But the long and short is, I'm not sure that I could really have a best-of heritage lines list in the UK. Dark White 73 asks, "Hey Chris, what's a locomotive in America you would have loved to review but couldn't because the budget wouldn't allow, lack of available information, or lack of surviving representation, etc.? Well, Sierra Railway No. 3 is obviously the one that got away, simply because the engine died shortly before I left the UK and is only due to return to traffic later this year, it seems. But in terms of time and budget allowance, it would have been nice to include the fleets of the Tweetsie Railroad, the East Broad Top, and the Nevada Northern, seeing as they've all got big followings of their own. As for lack of representation, Well, the New York Central Hudson Streamliners are ones I would just love to have covered. I know the Fort Wayne guys are planning to rebuild a Mohawk, and seriously, best of luck to them on that, but that's obviously years away, and who knows if I'll still be making slips that long. Twilight77 asks a very long "Hey Chris," but just to keep it short, what are your favourite stations you spend time on, both narrow gauge and mainline heritage lines? Well, again, there's too many to mention all of them, but off the top of my head, Horsted on the Bluebell has always been a nice place to just hang around between trains. Loughborough Central on the GCR has had plenty to offer whenever I've been. Most, if not all, of the Severn Valley stations are really nice for soaking up atmosphere. I like the look of Oakworth Station on the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway. Reader-Ronin on the Tallaght is just so peaceful, albeit not brilliant in wet weather. Haven Street on the Isle of Wight is so wonderfully self-contained these days. There's numerous others I could list, but those are just some of the ones off the top of my head. Spud607 asks, "Hey Chris, are there any plans to do slips in any other foreign country again that are closer to home, such as France, Finland, Italy, etc.? Would you also be open to revisiting some countries you've already been to, like Ireland and Germany? Love what you're doing, mate, keep it up." Cheers, buddy, I'll try keeping it up. Well, I've already started work on the Norwegian Type 21s, the Danish F-Class Well tanks, and the Austrian U-Class 062 tanks, so I guess I'll have to make trips to Norway, Denmark and Austria to finish those off. The NGG-16 Garretts have been in the works for a while, so I'll have to visit South Africa to finish that story. It would be nice to produce a special on the Brian's Rothorn barn in Switzerland, which would nicely complement a special on the Snowdon Mountain Railway fleet. But honestly, it kind of depends on demand. France and Italy have some lovely locomotives, but there's so much already in the works that I really need to finish more things off first. Henna4472 asks, "Hey Chris, what in your opinion will heritage rolling stock and motive power look like in a few decades? Will we see more modern machines taking over from older BR era units, both steam and diesel? Will we see a surge in preservation of post-privatisation units like Turbostars or even Pendolinos? I don't think we'll see that much of a takeover, as the enthusiasm just isn't there as it was for steam. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's at least one attempt at preserving various forms of modern rolling stock in some way, shape or form. I mean, if people are there to preserve pacers and want to preserve a VEP, then who's to say they'll stop there?" Butchie Bub asks, "Hey Chris, been an American fan of your content for many years and you opened my world to the railways of Britain. For my question, what opened your mind to the railroads of America, being books, TV, movies, etc.? It was probably seeing Wild West tropes on TV, like in Little House on the Prairie or Back to the Future 3 when that was being shown on TV. But what really opened my eyes was the old Dobbles Forest Railroad in Cornwall, a series of 7 1/4-inch gauge lines where all the locomotives were American prototypes. Since it closed in 2006, most of the rolling stock had since moved on to Australia. And man, do I miss it." Wando asks, "Hey Chris, what do you think will be the alternative to coal for heritage railways and railroads that run coal-fired steam in the future, since coal mining is being phased out? Whatever the HRA can negotiate, really. Heritage lines have been importing coal from overseas and will probably continue to do so for as long as they can, but it'll be interesting to see what the North Yorkshire Moors makes of their oil-firing experiments in the coming years." Mike Lyons asks, "Hey Chris, what are some British steam locomotive classes that are likely to take a long time to cover in Steam Locos in profile?" Well, strange as this sounds, they're mostly big LMS ones. I've been working on the Duchesses and Princess Royals since 2010, but both types haven't been the most active between then and now compared to Britannias, Black Fives, Halls, Genties and so on. Duchess of Sutherland has been pretty active until recently for sure, but she's been pulled facing loads of bottom-end work. Princess Elizabeth keeps getting stopped, needing more work on the boiler, and who knows, maybe there may come a point when the whole boiler needs throwing away and replacing. The Jubilees are also coming along, but the ones that aren't Bahamas have kept evading me over the years. Others, such as the WDs, have had one active survivor, but you can't really tell the story of that type without highlighting the other significant survivors that have been under overhaul since I started, such as Dame Vera Lynn. The Kings kind of have the same trouble. King Edward II has been active enough down the years, but you can't just tell the story with one of them, and King Edward I, we don't need to talk about King Edward I at the moment. There's loads that I'd like to finish off, but due to one thing or another, they just take their time. Armadilling asks, "Hey Chris, what was your involvement with SAF? Cool, that's going back a bit. Well, since you asked, after joining the forums in 2005, I cut my teeth in a couple of Thomas dubs, tried my hand at producing a few, and for some reason people seem to like them. It was fun to do them at the time, that some of them have really not aged that well. Besides which, after a few years, I kind of wanted to diversify into bigger things. I'm not so active on there nowadays, but that didn't diminish the friendships I made with various members over the years. Fun fact, Jago Hazard became a member around the same time as me. TechieBoy01 asks, "Hey Chris, any chance you could come back part-time for voice acting or narrating like in your Chris the Excellent era? I know a certain green engine that could use your vocals. I think that era's long since passed. I feel happier where I am, and I'm contributing a bit to society this way." While on the subject of Thomas, Jet the Hawk 1994 asks, "Hey Chris, what were your feelings when Britt Allcroft passed away, and do you have any plans for the Railway Series 80th anniversary?" I don't really have any plans for the latter, other than just sit things out and enjoy watching from a distance. And as for Britt Allcroft, well, I was sad when I found out the news, but my personal feelings don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. The fact remains that she was able to do what many have failed to achieve before and arguably since: bring a set of stories to a global audience that continue to enjoy it over 40 years later, which is a lot to be said when women are still facing scrutiny in the workplace. Wilbur Dawdry may have created the world of Thomas, but Britt helped to grow its audience tenfold with an interpretation that most fans, yes, me included, will always have a special place in their heart for. So thank you, Britt, for achieving your goal and bringing joy to millions in the process. Adam Bridgewater asks, "Hey Chris, do you have any particular funny anecdotes or memories from your time filming for Slips?" Well, there's been many laughs shared with other people for sure, but the funniest one looking back on it is the one I recited for the We Are Railfans virtual festival in 2021.
When we went out to Germany, we got to our place in the Harz Mountains after a 4-day drive. We stopped off for 2 days in the Netherlands, but it was a long old drive, and we settled down to watch The Great Escape, as you're a Brit when you're in Germany, but mostly because Adam hadn't seen it before. And anyone who's seen The Great Escape will know how it ends. You know, it ends with all of the actors looking slightly off camera, just like that. There's no sound effects, there's no dialogue, it's just the music being played in the background. And on this occasion, there was a sound that went off with the music and the actors. It was a World War II air raid siren, a German World War II air raid siren. And we thought at first that it was the DVD, so Sam paused it, and the music stopped, the film stopped, but the siren didn't. And we discovered then it was coming from outside. We learned about 2 hours later that it was the emergency siren from nearby, just undergoing testing. You know, should there be an avalanche or a flood, or should the village we were staying in be cut off for any reason. But the reason why we were so nervous about it going off was because earlier in that day, North Korea had launched a test missile going out over the Pacific Ocean towards America. So there we were, pretty much at midnight by this point, after a 4-day drive, and I was just thinking to myself, all right, who started World War III now?
Crosstone Junction 9817 asks, "Hey Chris, how do you think heritage railways, if at all, should adapt to modern climates to increase people through the gates and get gold in the bank? Many of them already have with a wider variety of themed events. But what I think we really need is the media personality ambassadors that we used to have. The likes of Fred Dibner, Bob Symes and so on. People who had genuine passion and authority for the subject matter with a big enough general following to put them on the map. Okay, we've got Francis, but he's obviously an acquired taste for some people. So the more people who can broadcast the interest and put it on the map for the masses, the better, really. If only there was a Clarkson's Farm for the heritage railway scene." David Malinsky asks, "Hey Chris, how do you think railway enthusiasm of model or heritage railways fits into other hobbies, subcultures, even art forms? What are some ways to bridge these gaps?" Of those three, it seems to fit other hobbies the most, seeing as it brings together all sorts of people from engineers and carpenters to academics, model makers, collectors, and all other kinds of interests. Subcultures and art forms? Honestly, I think railways deserve more exposure in the media both historically and dramatically. If films and TV shows are set on a railway somewhere, and Lord knows there are many decent stories worth setting on a railway, then the extra publicity can pay dividends in the long run. Look at the Railway Children, look at Thomas, look at Harry Potter, look at Back to the Future 3 or the Polar Express. You feature a train in a big blockbuster movie, chances are people are going to remember it and want to see it. As cool as it would be to have a proper Top Gear style show about railways on television, I think television has probably gotten past its most relevant years. So YouTube is pretty much the go-to platform for all niche subject matters. And as much as people turn up their noses at the concept of influencer culture, it's probably the most proactive in promoting rail enthusiasm for the future at the moment. Railways like the Mid-Hants and Tallaght Lynn have massive followings for their broadcast standard videos on railway practice and general updates, and it's just so easy to achieve that on YouTube instead of pitching stuff to the BBC and being forced into making creative compromises for a general audience who just don't get it. I'm so glad In the Loop doesn't degenerate to Great Model Railway Challenge style dad jokes.
Because when you're talking movies, you need a soundtrack.
Oh, shut the fuck up!
Scott917 asks, "Hey Chris, would you say an oversaturation of BR in preservation overshadows smaller companies like the Glasgow South Western, Taff Vale and North Staffordshire?" Oh, massively. If most of what the public sees are 9Fs, Black 5s, Bullies and other stuff that was generally seen at the tail end of Steam in the 60s, then they may be more surprised to learn about locos from smaller, earlier companies. It's a bit like how the presence of the Stockton and Darlington is oversaturated when there were loads of other early railways that came first, public and industrial. Mind you, what little we have from each company can stand out provided it wears its original uniform, as it tends to be more exciting to look at, so it seems like 6 and half a dozen there. Death Angel Productions asks, "Hey Chris, what are your thoughts on the Acura Scale Class 66? It's a shed. It's good for keeping your tools dry, except it's a model, so it can't even house a screwdriver. I guess that's all I got to say about it." Jake Jowett Me 8 Egg asks, "Hey Chris, got 3 questions I'll put here. Okay, better make them quick. 1. What's one class of engine you haven't done for slips that you want, but probably won't be able to? Pretty much anything that doesn't exist in preservation, as I've stated before. 2. Would a narrow gauge compilation of slips be possible in the future? Well, there already is with Manx and Miniatures, and there'll likely be others in the future. And 3. If it were possible, e.g. unlimited money, extra, what loco would you have made as a new build?" I think I've answered this one already. American Saxon 2101 asks, "Hey Chris, as a local Clevelander from the States, what do you think about the Northeast Ohio region on your trip set in the States to see the Flying Ingots, narrow gauge industrial Baldwin engines? Not the engines, but just the culture in the region of Northwest Ohio. Well, if you mean the Porters at Youngstown, I had an absolute blast shooting them. I had fun chasing number 765 along the Cuyahoga Valley. It was a great bonus to see the first Reading T1 number 2100 being worked on near Cleveland, and it was an honour to hang out with some of the well-known members of railroad circles in Ohio, including the former president of Conrail. Sadly, my visit to Ohio was a little marred by ending up in hospital after suffering from COVID and my body taking a battering in the recovery process, but overall, it was fun." The Only Tyre asks, "Hey Chris, what are your thoughts on the increasing scarcity of quality Welsh coal with the closure of Fozzifan and the long-term ramifications this may have on the preservation steam sector as a whole in the UK? I volunteer at Leighton Buzzard and our supplies only last until March. From then on, it seems to be Polish. However, that may not be an adequate solution for many." Well, first of all, thank you for sharing your experience at Leighton Buzzard. Second of all, while I've been informed the remaining supplies of Fozzifan coal weren't really that brilliant, the decision to stop mining coal in the UK and just relying on imports completely reverses any objective of reducing carbon footprint, I feel. The amount of CO2 per tonne in shipping goes up dramatically if you get it from Colombia, the Middle East, Poland, Australia, or anywhere else for that matter. Plus, any expert will tell you that you can't just throw in any old combustible fuel and expect it to generate the same amount of heat with less smoke. It's a complicated subject, and I wish the public and politicians would take a more nuanced approach to it. Midwestern Person 5740 asks, "Hey Chris, do you have a top 3 preserved American steam locomotives?" I don't know, I haven't seen them all yet. Admiring Sparks asks, "Hey Chris, what's your favourite colour?" Blue. Tanjoy0205 asks, "Hey Chris, will you ever release a Blu-ray version of your series? Also, will you do a steam locos in profile of Chinese Southeast Asia types?" Well, it depends if anybody wants them, and it depends if anybody wants them. Like I say with a return to Germany, any big overseas trip will necessitate a crowdfunder of some description, and it's anyone's guess if they won't be stigmatised further in years to come. Monopod Man asks, "Hey Chris, would you do a GTR on the best and worst modern TV programmes about trains and railways?" I used to think I would, but given the worst ones tend to deserve staying rightfully buried, and I've noticed there's a lot of toxicity when it comes to reaction negative stuff on YouTube these days, I would rather just not give them the light of day. As for the best ones, if I haven't talked about them already, I'm sure I would in time, but they deserve a little more thought and coverage than just slapping a few clips together and saying, "Hey, this thing exists, go check it out," without explaining why. Big Boy Productions ZL9RD asks, "Hey Chris, what is your personal opinion on the Thomas Hornby range, and could it ever be revived if the series gets better? It obviously did its job for the time, but since Bachmann have taken the baton, I do wonder if any other model firm could seriously throw their hat into the Thomas ring and make a success of it, let alone Hornby bring theirs back. They may well have the tooling for it, but it's mostly getting on for 40 years old now." Kinetic Rail asks, "Hey Chris, do you think that a lot of heritage railways have reached a tipping point where it's more about consolidating what they have instead of clowering to a long-held belief that they may never come to fruition?" Extension ambitions, for example. Some lines own miles of track bed, but are deciding instead to improve current facilities and improve the visitor experience. Good question. I think I've mentioned before that we shallowly tend to judge the quality of a railway by the length of the running line, but in some cases having miles of track just may become too much to handle. I don't know if we've reached a tipping point as such, but COVID certainly did make a lot of railways have a rethink. Jade Charlotte asks, "Hey Chris, if you could see any preserved loco on any preserved line, what would it be?" Mallard on the Great Central with a rake of teaks. Jude72 asks, "Hey Chris, who's your favourite engine on the Bluebell Railway? Mine's Fenchurch." Good choice, Jude. Mine's probably the 01. Rachel Carr asks, "Hey Chris, let's say all model railways and railways per se as a hobby ended tomorrow. What would you do instead?" Classic cars and music, I imagine. Retro Media Fan asks, "Hey Chris, what is your favourite model railway company?" Now you've got me, because I've always had a soft spot for Hornby, even though they've done a lot of things that I can't defend, but at the moment, it's probably Rapido, though that's always subject to change in time. Hufflepuff Batboy asks, "Hey Chris, what are some railway-related films or television shows that aren't Thomas that you'd like to cover one day?" One that I've been coming back to a lot recently is the BBC's Locomotion series from 1993. Does anyone remember that one? Otherwise, it'll be nice to revisit the British Transport Films era of filmmaking someday, but that'll take a long, comprehensive piece of work, I imagine. Making Tracks with Bob Symes obviously springs to mind, and in terms of films, it would be nice to have a look at the more art-style films like Rocky Mountain Express and A Steam Train Passes. You know, films that aren't so much plot-driven but have stunning cinematography and editing way ahead of their time. Mind you, every time I review something like this, YouTube's analytics tend to bury them for some reason instead of the more discussion-based issue topics. So I don't know. Maybe I'll do more railway films and TV shows, but if YouTube keeps being YouTube, then I don't know. Ford Motorman asks, "Hey Chris, what was your favourite locomotive to have made a slip-on for the last year? And what was your favourite locomotive in America? I hear you had a great time with Chris from Caledonia Works." In order of being asked, probably the T3 or the Brighton Atlantic. I was seriously impressed with the C&O H6 number 1309, but I really enjoyed covering the American standards. And yes I did. Ashley Likes Trains asks, "Hey Chris, what's your favourite historical railway?" Honestly, I'm not too sure. I have great admiration for the LNER, but like with heritage lines, I don't really have an all-time favourite above the others as such. OW Pictures 1450 asks, "Hey Chris, what's your opinion on Lucy the Cockerel tram at the NYMR? Lucy looks really sweet, and I'm glad Piglet is making the most of owning and running her." Great Western 5199 asks, "Hey Chris, what's the best way to get about when visiting railways to film trains? Do you often travel between locations using the train itself, or just follow it in a car? If you can get around by train, then it definitely frees up traffic and parking congestion on the roads and in nearby towns and residential laybys. But quite often, a car is just the most convenient way of doing it." Ewan Fawkes 2708 asks, "Hey Chris, what do you think has been one of the biggest missed opportunities in railway history?" Development of the steam turbine in the UK, without a doubt. If World War II hadn't intervened and Stanier had a chance to develop the turbomotive with better infrastructure in place, then I reckon the steam locomotive as a concept could have stepped up a gear. EMEME27655 asks, "Hey Chris, do you have your own layout?" Not at the moment, as I just don't have the time or the cash to build one. But maybe in time, who knows? It would be lovely to be able to build one eventually. Mason Jones N3U asks, "Hey Chris, do you plan on doing a model railway series?" I wasn't, simply because I don't really know what I could bring to the table that other people haven't. That, and I'm no expert on railway modelling, so who the hell would I be to show anyone how to build one? But then, when that's all said and done, I won't say never if that's the sort of thing that people would really like to see in the future. Prof. Crane Porter asks, "Hey Chris, with it being 200 years since the Stockton and Darlington opened, if money no object, what way would you add to the pioneering era of the heritage scene, be it a new build, route, set scene, etc.? If money were no object, a Rainhill Trials reenactment park, similar to the Golden Spike State Historic Park in Utah, would be an ideal place, I think. But more importantly, I'd like to finance the contemporary ways of researching the information that's been brought to light about early railway history. Not just in terms of locomotive technology, but everything else. For instance, Anthony Dawson has been struggling to raise finance for research on early railway clothing, but official sources have been forever rejecting his proposals. There are museums who are constantly trying to find new ways of immersing people in railway history from all eras, not just 1948 to 68. If money were no object, I'd finance things like that in a heartbeat. Pannier Fan 6412 asks, "Hey Chris, do you think the 57XX Pannier tanks are good engines?" Well, yes, I do. Given the Great Western ended up building 863 of them, I reckon they must have been far better than some shunters of similar vintage. Nick Train 123 asks, "Hey Chris, what is your favourite part about the Railway Series books?" Honestly, the thing I liked most about them on reflection was there seemed to be a time when they were evolving over time. They started as a simple means of entertaining a poorly child and could be seen, at least in the first few books, as an allegory for kids breaking rules, being disciplined and learning from their mistakes. Which is where I think we can all agree that so many clickbait articles get the sad story of Henry deliberately wrong. But flash forward to the early 60s and they become almost a running commentary for the end of steam in a changing world. There's a greater sense of mortality hinted at in some of the later stories. Death is even mentioned and then casually brushed off as a fact of life.
But His Grace had been killed in the war, and the new Duke, a boy, hadn't heard of his little engine.
So I like the fact that as time went by, Wilbur Awdry seemed to respect the intelligence of his audience as they grew up with his work, instead of just repeating the same tropes for the next wave of the initial target market. William Adams 7865 asks, "Hey Chris, what are your general thoughts on the Australian railway scene? Additionally, do you have any favourite locomotives over here, preserved or long gone? From what little I've seen of it, and this was a long time ago now, I like the bits that I saw, though I can imagine it must be a bugger if and when there's a total fire ban in place. And as for favourite locos, again, it was a long time ago, I can't help but gawk at 3801. Sorry, it's a cliche, and I'm sure there are objectively better machines preserved over there, but there's a lot to be said for something that can get the casual tourist to visit from the other side of the world." On the subject of Australia, Quinn's Victorian Trains asks, "Hey Chris, are you planning to come to do a Slips in Australia? Do you have any locos in mind?" It's on the bucket list, seeing as the third biggest region of my regular audience has been Australia since pre-COVID. But like America, I've looked at a potential budget at many points down the years, and every time I do, the prices escalate. If a series covering the likes of the New South Wales 38s, the Victoria Railway NAs and R-Class 464s, the Coffee Potter, the Peachy Reachy Railway and so on is ever made, then you're looking at a good £15,000 to £20,000 minimum, which I reckon could only really happen with another crowdfunding campaign, if crowdfunding campaigns don't get stigmatised against more as time goes by. Harrison of Colorado 8886 asks, "Hey Chris, do you know about any of the narrow gauge tourist railroads in America? If so, which one would be your personal favourite if you had a favourite? Of the ones I've seen, probably the pair of DNRG 3-footers in Colorado." Reedy 4580 asks, "Hey Chris, given how most people tend to focus on just locomotives, is there any piece of coaching stock that catches your fancy? I'm a sucker for anything pre-grouping, especially if it's first class. If you've ever ridden a director's saloon with a cream tea service like those at the Bluebell, then there's few finer things in life." Delvin with Damo asks, "Hey Chris, what is your most anticipated restoration or rebuild project that has recently been announced, or currently is ongoing?" Of the ones ongoing, I'm looking forward to the P2 Prince of Wales, the new Patriot, and potentially the new Clan. That's not to say that there aren't projects that don't deserve the support, since the likes of the Standard 3, G5, County and so on will serve a purpose and generate interest, but the P2 and Patriot particularly tick the most boxes for me. Simon Poole asks, "Hey Chris, how long does it take to put a GTI together? The editing stage can take 2 to 3 days, but the writing and research stage can take months, if not years, due to just having plenty of things on the go at once." Mitchell Whittington 2507 asks, "Hey Chris, since this is the big 80th anniversary year, I thought I'd ask, do you have a favourite Thomas character, Railway Series book and episode? Favourite character is a joint call between Edward and Henry, when they're being written as their author intended. Favourite book often changes from time to time, but it's usually one of the mid to late Reverend Awdry ones. And favourite episode was Edward's exploit. The story, the pacing, the way it was shot and edited, particularly the way the music built up towards the payoff. I always liked this one." Dino Leaf 91 asks, "Hey Chris, 2 questions." Okay, good thing these are short ones. 1. Do you like any artist or artwork that depicts trains? Quite a few. I've always got time for those online who are trying to do art for a living, and I'll always try to offer paid commissions for them wherever I can. It's better than AI. And 2, have you played any train-themed board games? Not many, but I've got a tremendous soft spot for the Great Game of Britain. If someone does a Cards Against Humanity style game that's train-related, then I'm on board. No pressure, Tom Scar. Midland Productions asks, "Hey Chris, Midland here. Question. What kind of unique locomotive would you like to see in the world of model railways? Such like a unique model of Big Bertha that was to be released either by Hornby, Bachmann or a new manufacturer." Well, I think Big Bertha is being developed by KR Models, but anyways, of all the ones that haven't been done yet, I'd quite like to see Gordon Highlander and a Ben, a Great Western Duke, though you can get kit bodies to go on a Bachmann Duke Dog chassis, if you've got the money to get them both, an LMS Fury, and definitely some more Era 1 stuff that's actually an Era 1 interpretation of Era 1, rather than a 1930s interpretation of it. Sunny Gappy 9717 asks, "Hey Chris, any plan for Asian locomotives like Japan, Thailand and Indonesia?" None at the moment, but we'll see. It obviously depends on demand over time, but I'm not going to say never, as there's obviously a lot of great railway history to tell in those parts of Asia. Jaden Vargan 2509 asks, "Hey Chris, which engine from Slip USA do you consider your favourite in general and filming wise?" Not sure if I can really answer that without being too self-indulgent, but let's just say I'm proud of all of them and I'd rather leave it up to you guys to decide which one's best. Train Goddess asks, "Hey Chris, how do you think Heritage Railways could become a more inclusive place for LGBTQIA+ individuals? Honestly, just accepting the fact that all people are people and it's not gender that defines someone and their abilities, but character. Physical strength obviously plays into that, but there are strong women and weak men as much as there are vice versa. Simply writing someone off just because they're trans, gay or any other is completely backward." Wellsworth Junction asks, "Hey Chris, were there any editorials that didn't make the final cut?" Well, there's numerous draft ideas which are started and never really developed for one reason or another, mainly because I didn't have anything to say about it that hasn't already been said, or that still requires a lot more research in order to make it something more meaningful. Ian B. Sparrow asks, "Hey Chris, a couple of questions. Again, glad these are short. 1. What's your most treasured memory from filming? Sharing my experiences with the multiple friends and connections I made with rail fans and volunteers over the years. 2. Are there any filming techniques and tips you've picked up over the years that you can pass on? Well, I've learned from bitter experience that a good tripod and an external microphone will be your best friends, that learning to use the manual settings on your camera, particularly exposure, will make a shot look more natural in the edit. Don't feel that you have to go for the biggest and most expensive camera out there, as it's never what you've got but what you do with it, but you can usually tell when someone has shot with a real video camera and when someone has either just used a DSLR or a phone. And most important of all, don't mix your frame rates. People will notice." The Signal Man asks, "Hey Chris, if you had to make a list off the top of your head of your favourite steam locomotives outside of the UK, what would be on the list and why?" I don't know really. It might end up being the subject of a future video if that's what people would like to see, but it'll need a bit more thought first. And if you don't mind me asking a second question, what were your thoughts on the musical Starlight Express? I'm not really much of an Andrew Lloyd Webber person, and I think I respected the existence of Starlight Express more than enjoyed it, but I think it's interesting what he could achieve by simply not securing the rights to the Railway series first. A lot of people say that copyright just gets in the way and should be outright ignored, but sometimes new intellectual properties and franchises can be born out of it. I mean, if George Lucas secured the rights to Flash Gordon back in the day, we wouldn't have had Star Wars. Mr. Expo 4300 asks, "Hey Chris, what's your opinion on railway video games? Mainly whether such a medium could be beneficial to the heritage railway industry. I guess in much the same way as railway films and TV shows, they can be seen as an introduction to the interest and as a means of developing it further. I'm not much of a gamer myself, but I used to love the Railroad Tycoon series, and when MSTS came out, I thought it was a bit of a game changer." Andy Davis Z6Q asks, "Hey Chris, 2 questions. 1, are your Steam Locos in Profile Blu-rays region free or are they region locked? There's only the USA series on Blu-ray, which is region locked, but there's an NTSC, or US Japanese version, and a PAL one, which is UK and Australian. And 2nd, what is your headcanon on what models are what characters in the Railway series and Thomas? I don't really look that deeply into the lore, to be honest, but that doesn't mean that nobody else should." MDH Games asks, "Hey Chris, when editing slips and YouTube videos, do you edit each video individually or one at a time? Or do you work on multiple projects and videos at once?" Well, I'm always working on multiple projects because there's multiple types of steam engines on multiple formations at work all over the country at any one time. As of putting this one together, I think I've got about 30 episodes of slips at various stages of production. Anything from writing to nearly ready to release. There aren't actually any ready to release at this stage, I'm just making that point. Mid-Sussex Railway asks, "Hey Chris, what was your favourite preservation moment from 2024? Probably seeing Beachy Head completed and running. Having first seen it as a boiler dumped in the yard at Sheffield Park some 25 years ago, to finally see it hauling a train was something truly amazing." Slyano 2795 asks, "Hey Chris, what's your favourite LNER locomotive and livery of the engine?" Gresley A4 in Garter Blue. Steam Rail Willie asks, "Hey Chris, since your trip to the USA, have you gotten or plan to get any models of a USA locomotive?" None really, but if I ever get into 009, then a main Fawny would be mandatory. Ian Smith 4897 asks, "Hey Chris, I've had trouble buying the DVDs on your website. I'm in the USA and it's hard to navigate for me. It's because of PayPal, by the way. Well, I'm sorry to hear you've been struggling, but if it's any use, I deliver to America and you no longer need PayPal to buy them. But if that's still a struggle, then there's Patreon and YouTube membership if you'd like to see the whole back catalogue. The choice is yours, but don't hesitate to contact me if you're still having trouble." Renowned16 asks, "Hey Chris, do you think you'll ever come down under to do slips? As a person who lives in Victoria, it would be great to see videos on our engines. If I'm welcome in Australia, and if an appropriate crowdfunding campaign is successful, then as stated earlier, yes, I'd love to." Station Shunter asks, "Hey Chris, how many videos have had problems with locomotives failing or your equipment not cooperating?" Well, the Britannias were obviously uncooperative. There have been incidents with Jubilees and Duchess of Sutherland dropping out when it was too late for me to change plans. In terms of gear not cooperating, I got caught in a downpour at the Cuyahoga Valley in Ohio, resulting in me having to send my old camera back to the menders and buy a new one. Word of warning to everyone with a Panasonic HCX 1500E. Awesome camera, but best get a rain cover because they're not very good in the rain compared to other cams. Jack Stevens 7562 asks, "Hey Chris, 2 questions. Best make them quick then. Do you think West Coast will cease operations soon because LSL are the mainline charter operators now? I think only West Coast or the ORR can end West Coast now. And what do you think will happen when Mallard hits her 100th birthday and anniversary of her speed record? I'd say that's up to the NRM. Much as it would be lovely to see her run again, even if it's just for one day, it's their call." James Lee asks, "Hey Chris, as a collector of physical media, my question is, have you ever considered doing a best-of collection for slips?" Well, problem I have with best-ofs is that everyone has their own favourites, and so a best-of from my opinion would end up being someone else's not very best-of. So, I don't know. Maybe in time, but it needs more thought. Toby's Trains asks, "Hey Chris, what is your favourite loco from the southern region?" S15s. Smurfy Dan 1991 asks, "Hey Chris, what are you looking forward to celebrating for Railway 200? If it happens, seeing the locomotion replica on the main line later in the year." Osten Rail asks, "Hey Chris, have you had much to do with the model railway scene in Australia?" None whatsoever. Majestic Trains asks, "Hey Chris, just wondering, what are your thoughts on the overcrowding situation at galas?" It's just something that happens really. It's good for the railway in question to sell more tickets and run more into the black, as it were. And yeah, it's annoying when it becomes sardine tins standing room only, but it's just the way it is, sadly. At least it's not a permanent trope with running heritage railways. The Average Teleporter 7435 asks, "Hey Chris, can we expect the 2020s reviewed in 2030? Possibly. I guess it depends if Gauge the Issue will last that long. Or if there's demand for it to last that long, of course." The Swiss 7F500 asks a lot of questions, but the one I'll answer is, "Hey Chris, when will Draw My Engine come back?" Well, if you mean paint your engine, I don't think I'm likely to do any more of those, to be honest. I've learned to accept the fact that they really weren't that good, and whenever I uploaded one, the ad revenue wasn't very good and I kept losing subs instead of gaining them. I had hoped it would encourage people to pick up a paintbrush and have a go at railway art themselves, but if it did, then there doesn't seem to be many of them. LolLolXY4RH asks, "Hey Chris, would you consider parts of old engines like that an original boiler of the LBS-CR H2 that later got turned into a new build as an original engine that survived into preservation, or as a full-on new build steam engine?" Well, I normally try to respect whoever built and owned it, how they refer to it. People often assume, and I've made this mistake myself in the past, that the 2 new Corris Railway engines are replicas, when they both take new numbers in the sequence. While Didcot's new Saint uses the boiler and frames from a Hall built in 1929, but it still takes a new number in the sequence. So I'd say it's a case-by-case matter, even though it's normally down to the identity of the frames. Alpha 008 asks, "Hey Chris, if you could afford it, which part of the world would you most like to visit to make new slip videos now that you've done your US trip?" Dark as this sounds, the place I want to visit the most to document their steam railway history and technology is probably never going to happen because it's simply too dangerous. Syria and Jordan in the Middle East is an area that's fascinated me ever since I saw Alexei Sayle trying to cross it back in the mid-90s, and since being introduced to David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia, which is by far and away my favourite film of all time. But local and international politics have made it too much of a war zone down the decades. A Hejaz Railway special would be truly amazing, but potentially fatal. East Coast Steam 4468 asks, "Hey Chris, where do you see preservation in 50 years? With the expense and complexity of contemporary stock and electrification, is traction availability going to be an issue? Will we see an OHLE equipped preserved line? If preservation is still around in 50 years' time, then I'll be happy. As for OHLE, there already is one, the Seaton Tramway in Devon." Okay, joking aside, there's bound to be some attempts by some groups at some stage in life. But given how electric preservation groups have it even tougher to attract the general public compared to steam ones, they would have to really have everything in their favour to succeed, I think. Second Valve Steam asks, "Hey Chris, do you believe it's possible for TOCs such as Locomotive Services Limited and West Coast Railways to reach a position where they can amass too many locomotives?" Probably not as such, but I guess it depends on their long-term business plan for mainline running. Though if it results in a shortage of suitable locomotives for other mainline firms and heritage lines, then perhaps it could? Not sure. Alex Fisher and Tank Engine 97 ask a similar question. "Hey Chris, which subject on Gauge the Issue have you found the most fascinating to talk about and why?" Well, it's an honour and a privilege, even though it can be tiresome sometimes, to talk about social matters concerning people within railway circles, be they the strikes within the rail industry or how volunteers have really found themselves struggling to keep going. As for what's been the most fascinating specifically, well, again, it's been mostly social issues like the Linton and Barnstable and Alistair Burgess a couple of years ago. Aidan Strand 4864 asks, "Hey Chris, what railway event, gala, etc. that you've attended was your favourite?" Probably Hunslet 125. Regular galas have come and gone, but that was something really special. LSWR 488 asks, "Hey Chris, how did you discover your liking of trains?" Well, it's funny, I can't remember anything before I was about 3 years old and started going down the Bluebell Railway on family outings, but I do remember seeing Mallard in York Station when she was in steam when I was barely months old and not being intimidated by her. Obviously Thomas helped things along, but Mallard and the Bluebell were both catalysts, as it were. T-Bone is Gaming asks, "Hey Chris, having produced a lot of videos for YouTube over the years, do you have any advice for small channels with a few hundred subscribers on how to grow?" Well, there's tons of advice which may work for you but may not, so best to pick and choose from the following points. Firstly, take a look at what other content creators are doing, see what works for them, and what you can bring to the table that they're not, be that in terms of style, format, personality, etc. 2. Consistent quality of uploads will help a channel grow. It's hard work for sure, but the algorithm seems to favour regular uploaders with a distinctive style. Thirdly, if you can upload stuff as soon as you've shot it, then so much the better. Channels like Brickish Rail, Speed to the West, the Southerner, the Modster, to name but a few, tend to upload stuff within hours of shooting it. I wish I could do that. All that being said, fourth, don't burn yourself out while you're doing it. It's easily done, but if you find yourself working and working and working without any kind of break whatsoever, it's only a matter of time before you crash and you can't do anything. I know I'm guilty of that myself only too often, mainly because that's just the nature of the job sometimes, but I wouldn't want anyone to make the same mistakes that I've made down the years. Other than that, I can only really pass on the advice that Bob Symes passed on when it came to model railway construction.
And it really isn't too hard, provided you follow a few simple rules and techniques. Take a little care, and don't get too anxious if things don't turn out right the first time. With a little practice, things will come right, and the sense of achievement and the amount of satisfaction you'll get when it's finished will be enormous.
And finally, Thomas Ladyfan asks, "Hey Chris, has there been a time when you've considered quitting on making steam locos in profile? If so, what was the motivation to keep you going at it?" Well, there were two occasions really, both of them quite early on. The first happened in August 2012, when I'd only had the first 3 episodes finished. Google randomly removed my AdSense one day due to what they called invalid click activity. They didn't clarify what this was, but it basically meant my monetization didn't exist anymore. Now, believe it or not, I never went into this venture just to make money, because if I wanted to make loads and loads of cash for not much work, then I'd become a politician. But unless it could pay for itself, it simply couldn't last. Thankfully, Simon from the BRWS offered me a publication deal on his channel, which lasted a little under 12 months. I ended up going back to my own channel, by which time monetization had been reinstated. The second time was around the summer of 2014. I wanted to keep going, because by then it had built up enough of a following, and just stopping it altogether would have let fans down. But I'd learned the hard way that the ad revenue alone just wasn't enough to justify it. I therefore decided to respond to the demand from fans at the time to release it on DVD and see if that helped to elevate it, which within a year or so, it did. Money isn't a motivation so much as a necessity. What really keeps me going is knowing the positive effects that it has on those who enjoy it. How it encourages people to research about railway technology and history, how it encourages them to get out and visit their local heritage line or join it and start volunteering at it, even go as far as find work within the rail industry as a result of it. I know sometimes I talk about stuff that puts people off getting into railways, and I'm sorry if it does, but anyone who's tuned in and supported what I do down the years, even the stuff that hasn't worked out, thank you. You are the reason I keep this up, and it's a privilege to keep doing so. So don't ever stop being awesome, all of you. So there we are. Thank you to everyone who's asked their questions. Thanks for being patient with me while I ramble out the answers, and see you again in 5 years, I suppose. Maybe. I'm Chris, and I'm here to gauge the issue.